Okay, hi, welcome to Rav Shurin's and Yaakov class. We're very excited. I just want to thank Tzipora Gutman for her very generous donation that is allowing us to offer this course. So thank you so much, and it should be a zechus for Yeshuos and Besuros Tovos for the situation in Eretz Yisrael. Thank you so much, Tzipora, and thank you, Rav Shurin.
Okay. So we'll begin with sort of an introduction. I gave out two sets of sheets. The first set has, I think, four parts to it. I'm only going to read a little bit on each sheet, so don't get nervous about it. And okay, Miriam. Hi, Miriam. Now, let's start off with talking about first. There are two areas in the Torah which we already find in the Torah itself. In the Torah Shabbat, we find that there are stories and there are laws, right? Bereshis has mostly, but not solely, mostly stories. Shmos has a lot of stories, but it does have a lot of halachot as well. And Vayikra has a lot of halachot, maybe a little bit of stories, and Bamidbar has a real division of laws and stories. Dvarim is a recap, so it has a lot of halacha, but it also has Moshe Rabbeinu speaking to the Jewish people as well, recapping, which is more like a story rather than purely mitzvot. And that's important because I think the Talmud, which is divided between stories and halacha, and just like in the Torah, the stories are sort of intertwined with the halacha. In the Torah, we generally find that the Gemara, the Midrashim are going to ask whether it's Midrash Halacha, Midrash Agada, is going to ask questions like, why is this story next to this halacha, right? In the Talmud, there's not really a question like that, because when you have a story next to halacha, it's quite obvious in most cases. I wouldn't say in all cases, most cases, why one is being put next to the other. But bottom line is that there's a mixture, okay? If not, I'm not mistaken, I heard this from an uncle of mine, Rabbi Aaron Soloveitchik, he knew all of Shas, and he told me there are more pages of stories in Shas than there are of halacha. Just to point that out, that how important stories are. And again, I'm not referring here to stories about halacha. In other words, there's a lot of that in the Talmud as well, when they introduce halacha, and then they tell you a story about how a certain Tana or a Mora, a certain rabbi, fulfilled that particular halacha, right? Those are halachic stories. We're not going to be talking about halachic stories. We're going to be talking about, the only way I could say it is stories, right? Or if you want to call it hashkafic stories, right? The stories that you have in the Torah, in many of the cases, they don't have any direct relevance to halacha. The stories, let's say, of Avram Avinu, or the stories in Shmos about the Jewish people in Egypt, and even stories later on after Matan Torah, the Jews complaining, right? They're not really halachic stories, if they're complaining about the water or food or whatever have you. They're really much more what we would call hashkafic stories, and that's what we're supposed to take out of them, is a certain, obviously that's what God wants us to take out of the Torah, is a certain way of acting and a certain way of not acting. And many times the Jewish people didn't act properly. God wants us to pick that up and learn things from it. When we get to the Talmud, we have the similar idea. We have stories, we have halacha and stories that are relevant to the halacha that we just learned. And then there are, in the last course that we gave, there were a number of stories like that as well that were relevant for halacha. We had one with regard to going to a rabbi and asking questions, right? So those are halachic stories, even though they were stories. A woman comes to a rabbi, she says, I asked Rabbi X, about a certain Hilchot Nida Shaila, and now I'm asking Rabbi why about it, right? That's a halachic story. But we have also Haggadah stories, that those are the ones we're going to be focusing on. And let's begin by just saying that Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid in our first source, and all I want is like 2 lines there. Shmuel HaNagid, who is Rabbi Shmuel HaNagid? He wrote an introduction to the Talmud. He lived in the 10th century. He lived before Rashi. He was still in the Gaonic period, and he wrote an introduction to the Talmud where he tries to like sort of organize what the Talmud is trying to do. So one of the things he says, and he says it in a very short manner, is he speaks about what he calls Haggadah, not Agadah, but Haggadah, which is the same thing. We just use Haggadah today for our Haggadah Shel Pesach, but it's really a similar word. And he says, if you see where I underlined, the Haggadah hu kol pirush yavo b'Talmud al shum inyan shelo yiyeh mitzvah zu. Shelo yiyeh mitzvah. This is a commentary that will come in the Talmud on a matter that is not a mitzvah. Zui Haggadah. This is Haggadah. In other words, it's not discussing a mitzvah, the Haggadah, right? If it's discussing a mitzvah, we'll call it halacha, right? And you only learn from it what seems to your mind, meaning what you could think of. What can I learn from it? Meaning that the Talmud is not going to be telling me stories just like, a fairy tale, a stam story, right? They're going to be telling me a story for me to interpret in a certain way. Question is it very deep? Is it not very deep? Are there a number of different levels you can interpret it? We'll be discussing that as we go on. Some of the things we're going to be talking about, I'm not going to introduce to you right away. I'm going to introduce to you as we learn the stories. That's page 1. Page 2 is important because here we're going to find a definition of what the point of Agadot are. Okay, so on this page I have certain things we'll do now, certain things maybe we come back to, but on this page to the top right, first the Medrash Halacha, the Sifrei. Now again, I want to remind you, the Sifrei is a basically halachic commentary that has some Agadah in it, but in this case, the Sifrei was a commentary on the Torah written in the Tanoic period, very early, Second Temple period. For Sifrei is for Bamidbar and Dvarim. So, and we have this Sifrei till today, organized in a number of different people organized it. One of the famous people organized it is the Malbim. The Malbim's commentary on the Torah is not really a commentary on the Torah. It's really, when you have the Sifrei and the Sifra and the Mechilta, it's really a commentary on the Medrash Halacha. No, because we have 2 types of Medrashim. We said before, in the last times we met, there's Medrash Halacha, Medrash Agadah. Both of them have share in common is that they drash a pasuk, but one demands of a pasuk that is something halachic, so demands an oral law from the pasuk that's halachic, and one demands from the pasuk an oral law. That's where drash means to demand. It demands from the pasuk something that is agadah, okay, something that's not halacha, but it's something that is, we'll call it hashkafa, okay, something that is, just like we have a separation of our mind and our heart. So the halach is more of the mind, right? And the agada is more of the heart. That's really the difference, is the emotional versus the intellectual, right? The halacha appeals to the intellectual. Or Soloveitchik used to say, if not for my mother, I would have been a robot, because I would have fulfilled all the halachot, he says, but I wouldn't have had any heart to it. It wouldn't have had any emotion to it. My mother when I saw her making Shabbos, I didn't necessarily see all the halachot that I got from my father, he says, but I got from my mother not, I called it ashkafa, meaning but the heart of the halacha of Shabbos. You know, is the Shabbos, that things I'm obligated to do, and even I'm not even talking necessarily about malacha of Shabbos. I'm talking about like kvod Shabbat, right? But he watched his mother, how she sets up the table for Shabbat, she sets up the candles for Shabbat, right? That's all what we would call the emotional side of Shabbat. We would call that not the heart of Shabbat, and not the mind of Shabbat, right? So Soloveitchik said that if I hadn't have my mother, I would have been like a robot. I would have fulfilled Shabbat very meticulously, but it would have been like the letter of the law. Whereas we know, and this is a new, and again, this is, you can call it by many names. So we'll call one the letter of the law and one the spirit of the law, right? And even though we're not going to be talking about an individual mitzvah, but when we'll talk about the spirit of Judaism versus the letter of Judaism, right? The letter of the law, the letter of Judaism versus the spirit, which Judaism has both. And they appear in the Talmud very, very mixed together, right? Halacha and Agadah, the mind and the heart, the spirit and the letter are all very much mixed up in the Talmud. I'm going to stress that because in a minute we're going to talk about the Sefer Ein Yaakov, but before we get to there, okay? So the first thing will on top it says how important it is to learn both. Shelo Tomar, that's top right. Shelo Tomar lamadati halachot daily. I learned halachot. I know the halacha. It's enough. Talmuloma kiyim shamar tishmunet kol hamitzvah hazot. Kol hamitzvah limot midrash halachot v'agadot. One should learn the midrash of halachot and agadot, right? You should learn both. In other words, a person should not. We learn from the pasuk which says kol hamitzvah. So the mitzvah means, of course, half that mitzvah is, or part of that mitzvah is intellectual, is the letter of the law. Then you have the spirit of the law. Okay, that's what he says. In other words, a person could say, in other words, this Medrash Halacha is saying from the Tanaic period, a person would say, why do I have to get involved with Agadah, which are stories, right? Let me just learn Halacha and I'll be very safe. By the way, there are many people who still feel like this today, even though they have to ignore this particular Sifrei. But then the Sifrei says something else also a little bit later on in the same parsha, in Parshas Eikev, it says, Dorshei Rishumos Omrim. It's not clear who these people are. It says the Dorshei Rishumos, but a lot of people learn means the people who drash psukim. Some people say it's the Kabbalists, but it's not clear. Omrim, Ritzon Chashatakir, Misha Haya Vahaya Olam, Misha Amar Vahaya Olam. If your will is to recognize the one that said, and the world was, right? Mishu Omer, God said, right? Asora my moros, right? God said 10, right? Yehiyar, right? That's Vayomer Hashem, Yehiyar, right? If you want to know that creator that said and the world was, Limod Haggadah, learn Haggadah. Shemitoch kach ata makir et HaKadosh Baruch Hu umedabek b'drachav. Very interesting. He says, learn Haggadah because, and here it says the Hey as opposed to the Aleph, Haggadah, right? Like Reb Shmuel Anogin, because by learning Haggadah, tamakir et HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you'll get to know God, and you will attach yourself, connect yourself to His ways. Okay, here it's very clear that one can learn halacha and not be connected to God. I know some people might find that amazing, but I've definitely met people who learn a lot of halacha, but they have absolutely no connection to God. They think they have a connection to God, right? They talk about God's Torah, right? But they never talk about God. Okay? That's that. There are definitely people like that, and that's what this Medrash Halacha is saying, right? If you want to recognize God, don't just learn halacha. You have to learn Haggadah, and then you will get to know God. Makir HaKadosh Baruch Hu medabek b'drachav, and you can get to know his ways. That you know through Agadah, and that you don't know through Halacha, right? So that's a very important concept, because at the end of the day, don't we want to through our Halacha get to know God? How many people do we know, men or women or boys and girls, that left Judaism because all they were taught was Halacha, right? And they weren't really taught the connection of God to the Halacha. And therefore, it became empty to them, right? With no fault of their own. They just couldn't connect, right? So sitting and learning Gemara day and night, you have guys sitting and learning Gemara day and night. Some of them, by the way, were outstanding students, and then they became secular because it was a very good challenge to learn Halacha, learn the Gemara. It's a very intellectual academic challenge, but you don't necessarily connect it to God. Rabbi Yitzchak Blazer once pointed it out. The famous student of Rabbi Shlomo Salanter, Ritzel Petterberger, pointed out that in order to avoid himself becoming too academic and not connecting to God, the way he would learn a Mishnah was Beis Shammai Omrim. Beis Shammai said that God meant X. Beis Hillel Omrim, and Beis Hillel said God meant Y. Now, when you learn the Mishnah, it doesn't say God said in the Mishnah. It says Beis Shammai said that Beis Shammai said X. Beis Hillel said Y. But he would stick in that Beis Shammai said that God meant X, and Beis Hillel said that God meant Y. Why? Because he felt by himself that he's not getting the connection. And but once you know that Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel were arguing about what God meant, so then you have your connection, right? So he says that's what Agadah is for. Okay. Now, to bring out the importance of Agadah, right? I want to just quote a famous medrash that Rashi quotes, right? It's right in the top of the page in the middle. Vayiktein Tevin u'mispol ha'gmalim. And it says that when Eliezer came to Rivka, right, and he was getting Eliezer was getting the water, and the family put down, Rivka really put it out, she kept drawing the water, and then it says he gave different food for the camels. Amar Avacha, Yofas sichasin shel avdei beit of batei avos mitarasin shel banim. Okay, it is more beautiful, the words of the servants of the house of our fathers, not Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but Avram's servant Eliezer. His words are more beautiful mitarasin shel banim than the Torah itself of the children. In other words, the Torah that we received on Sinai. Parashaso shel Eliezer shneimu shlosha dapim. The parsha of Eliezer is 2 or 3 columns in the Torah. As you know, the whole story repeats itself. It's one of the longest stories we have, maybe even the longest story we have in the Torah, right? Hu omra v'shoneh. He says it, God says it, and then he repeats it again, right? V'sheretz migufei Torah v'ein damo matama kipsaro elami riba mikra. And a sheretz, which is a like an example of a mouse or some sort of creepy crawling object, right, is part of the Torah with regard to it defiling a person that touches it, and its blood doesn't give you the same level of tumah, of defilement, as the mouse itself. The blood that you touch doesn't give you the same level, except we learn it from an extra word in the pasuk. Okay, one word. Some people say the word is hatame instead of tame. It says hatame, and some people say because it says vizeh and it doesn't say zeh, right? Just a vav or a hey. We learned that the blood is the same as the sheretz itself, as the creepy crawler itself. Otherwise, we wouldn't know that. How do we learn it? From one letter, right? But when it came to the story of Eliezer and Rivka, it didn't give you like a few psukim. It gave you 40 psukim, then it repeated the 40 psukim, right? So it's like most of the parsha of Chayesara is the story of Eliezer and how he gets Rivka from her parents and her brother to be the Kala, the bride of Yitzchak, right? So what do you see from over here? You see that the laws that we learn in the Torah are not nearly as significant as the stories. That's what it seems to say over here. It's a very big chiddush, but the Medrash says it, right? That the way Eliezer spoke was much more important than the laws that we learn, because the laws that we learn from one word, one letter, one half a sentence. But this, we needed a whole extra parsha and repetition. So there must be something in this parsha that's very important, right? And the commentaries all ask this question, like, what's so important about this shidduch that we have to give it 40 psukim, then repeat it again, right? But in the Medrash, it says very clearly that it's more beautiful, the words of Eliezer, than the Torah itself. Very scary what it says, if you think about it, right? And I'll just tell you over what my grandfather said. So we will just get, that's only one opinion. My grandfather said, because after the whole story, right, the family says, right, the family Betuel, and the family says, when Eliezer asks, are we going to make a shidduch here? May Hashem yatsa adava. From God, this went out. Wait a minute, these guys are not godly people. They're idol worshipers, right? So he convinced the family that this is all from God. Well, unbelievable. That's it's not a halacha, it's hashkafa, but it's an unbelievable hashkafa, because that's what Avram Avinu was out to do his whole life, was to take idol worshipers and make him the monotheist. And that's what Eliezer was doing here. At the end of the whole discussion, it says, May Hashem yatzadavar, we can't hold her back if this is what God wants. It says, May Hashem, Yud-Hey Vav-Hey, right? So you see that they became God-fearing people. They got, and that's a big thing, So obviously, the hashkafa of creating a God-fearing person was much greater than a particular halacha, because halacha doesn't necessarily create a God-fearing person. But this hashkafa, this is the way Eliezer spoke, created God-fearing people, like Avram Avinu. So that tells you that very much defines the difference between halacha and agada. Halacha is the letter of the law. Agada is the spirit of the law. Halacha speaks to the head, the mind. Agada speaks to the heart. And you really need both. And the agadic part is just as important, if not more important. And here we come to a Avot de Reb Natan, Avos de Reb Nosson, right? I don't know if everybody's familiar with Avos de Reb Nosson, so I'll familiarize you with it, right? We know there's something called Pirkei Avot, right? We know that between Pesach and from Pesach onward, originally it was Pesach and Shavuos, and now it's Pesach onward till Sukkot, right? We learn the Mishnah is called Avot, right? We have six chapters, is really officially 5 chapters, and then we added a brisa, but that's what we learn, okay? What we don't learn is something that's even more interesting. It's called Avos de Rabbi Nosson. Rabbi Nosson, who was a Tana, put together a more broader on each Mishnah that Rabbi Nosson wrote about. He talks much more lengthy about each Mishnah. A lot of stories, a lot of halachot, that if you learn this, right, it doesn't only have like 5 chapters, it has over 30 chapters, okay? And it's been compiled. Reb Nosson compiled it, and it's very, very interesting. If you know the famous story of Rabbi Akiva, that when he was a shepherd and then he went to learn in yeshiva, and that whole story about him is not anywhere in the Talmud. It's in Avos de Reb Nosson, right? It talks about the concept of a person learning Torah at a later age, and it gives you Rabbi Akiva and tells you the whole story of the well, he sees it dripping and how the water makes an impression on the stone. That's all in Avos to Rabbi Nosson. Okay, so in Avos to Rabbi Nosson, we have the following Breita. Rabbi Yitzchak Omer, you see page 3, and towards the bottom right, it says Rabbi Yitzchak ben Pinchas Omer. Yitzchak, the son of Pinchas, said, Kol mi sheyesh biyodo midrash, ve'ein biyodo halachot. If a person has in his hands the midrash, but he doesn't have halachos, lo tam shel chachma. Okay, if he has in his hands the medrash, right, but he doesn't have in his hand halachot, okay, that means the way I'm understanding it is he has midrash, but he doesn't have the halachot itself, meaning he has the drashot of the pasuk, okay, but he doesn't have in his hands the halachot. Because a lot of times you drash a pasuk, but you don't know the halacha, how the halacha comes out. Lo tam shel chachma. He didn't really taste the taste of chachma. Okay, kol mi sheyesh biyado halachot ve'en biyado midrash, but a person that has in his hands halachot, and he doesn't have in his hands midrash, lo tam shel yirat chet. But if he has in his hands halachot, right, but he doesn't have midrash, and here I'm understanding midrash as midrash haggadah, lo tam shel yirat chet. He doesn't have in his hands. He didn't taste the tam of yirat chet, of God, of being afraid of a sin. Okay, what does this mean? This means, a person could do halacha, but not be a Yarei Shamayim, right? He's not afraid of sin yet. Kol mi sheyesh biyado midrash ve'ein biyado halachot ze gibor ve'ein mezuyan. Person who has in his hands midrash, but he doesn't have in his hands halachot, because again, midrash can mean two things. It can mean midrash halacha, midrash agadah. So he has midrash, right? But he doesn't have in his hands halachot. Ze gibor ve'ein mezuyan. He's going to be a gibor, okay? But he doesn't have the sword, right? He's very strong because hashkafa makes you very strong, but you still don't know what to do because ein biyado halachot. Kol sheyesh biyado halachot ve'ein biyado midrash, chalash v'zayin biyado. Okay, if he has in his hands halachot and he doesn't have in his hands midrash, he's weak, but he has the tools. He has the sword, but he's very weak, so he can't really use the sword properly. So what does midrash do? Both midrash halacha, midrash haggadah, it gives you strength. Okay, the midrash halacha gives you strength because you know where it comes from. You know where the halacha comes from, right? You know the source. The source is from the Torah, so that gives you strength. Or midrash haggadah, you know where it comes from, right? It comes from the Torah. You're drashing it from the Torah, or it's midrash haggadah, which of course is going to work on the heart, going to work on the spirit. Okay, so that will, the person who has in his hands halacha, but he doesn't have in his hands midrash. He's very weak in his personality. He can't overcome his challenges, but he has tools, right? And he can use those tools. Yesh biyado zeh v'zeh, but if he has both midrash and halacha, gibor mezuyan, then he is he's a strong person, and he has even the tools to overcome what he needs to overcome. Meaning, because a person who has great hashkafa, but he doesn't have halacha, right? He may be very strong about his conviction to God, but doesn't know what to do. Like lo am haaretz chasid. You can't have a person lo bor yirei shamayim, right? A person who is a uneducated person, a boor, right? He can't be Yarei Shamayim, not because he doesn't fear God. We have plenty of people who have this basic fear of God, but they don't know what to do, right? So that's the way one can learn this particular office to Reb Nosson, that the Midrash brings Lirei Shamayim because it's dealing with the heart as opposed to the mind. Okay, now let's get on to a discussion about the Ein Yaakov. Okay, before we get on to number 4, we'll get into discussion of Ein Yaakov. What's the discussion of Ein Yaakov? Ein Yaakov is a compilation, right? The name of a sefer, Ein Yaakov, the eye of Yaakov. It's a compilation of all the Medrashim in the Talmud. Not all the Medrashim we have. It's not a compilation of Medrash Rabbah, Tanhuma. He plucks out of the Talmud the Medrashim, the stories, and he separates them from halacha, which, by the way, was something which was a very big chiddush. It was something that was not simply acceptable. I mean, Ravina Ravashi codified them all together. So the question, of course, is why did he feel he wants to pluck them out? Why does he want to take out the Agadah from halacha and separate it out? Okay, so if you look at, I don't think he discusses it openly, a little bit hidden. He discusses it in introduction. His name was Rabbi Yaakov ibn Chabiv. Okay, Rabbi Yaakov ben Chabiv, right? And he lived in Spain. He was born in Spain in 1450 or 1460, before the expulsion of Spain. So he was sort of at the end of the period of the Rishonim, okay, very much at the end. And he was expelled. Then he went to Portugal, and he was expelled, of course, from Portugal. And then, of course, he went to Turkey, and he spent the rest of his life in Turkey. He started plucking out the stories from the in the Talmud from the Halacha. Okay, and again, over here, he's not 100% scientific. Sometimes you'll have a halachic story being plucked out, but most of the time it's very much agadic stories, right? And sometimes you don't even know where they come from because you pluck them out. So we don't know what it's really relating to. We just see the story, but we don't know how the story got there, right? Ravina Ravashi, when they codified the Talmud, now you knew how the story got there. And sometimes you'll even actually have that as a question. But he tried as much as possible to make the stories independent of the halachic discussion in the Talmud, right? A lot of times I go back and look at the Talmud because I want to see like where exactly it came from. And the first story we'll do will actually have that question and have to just answer it briefly. But the point over here is he separated the two. And the question is why? So what happened actually in Lithuania, Poland, Russia, was they became groups of people that just studied Ein Yaakov. Okay, there was Chevra Shas. There were people who were going over the Shas, not necessarily Daf Hayomi, but they were going through Shas. It was called Chevra Shas, the Chevra that studied Shas. And then there was a Chevra of Ein Yaakov. Okay, and they would go through the whole Talmud of Ein Yaakov, a couple of thousand dapim, right? He got through Zroyim, and he got through Moed, and then he passed away. And his son, Reb Levi ibn Chabiv, right? Reb Levi ben Yaakov, right? He was a Rav Yerushalayim. He made a lot of trouble for the Jewish people, but he was a very chashuv Rav Yerushalayim. And he finished off his father's sefer. He went through Noshim, Nezikin, Kachim, right? He went through all the different Masechta Nida and Taurus, right? He went through all the 6 parts of the Talmud, right? 6 parts of the Talmud was divided into 6 parts. Rabbi Yehuda Nossi divided it, and he finished off what his father, by the way, wanted to do Yerushalmi too. Not only Bavli Yerushalmi, and he started it, but he didn't finish it because he passed away about in the early 1500s, like 1511, something like that. He was born either 1450 or 1460, we don't know, but he passed away about 1511, which is the early 16th century, right? But he never finished. So his son, I said his son was a troublemaker. I'm going to tell you what the trouble was, but we won't discuss it. When Reb Yosef Cairo decided, and the Rebbe Rav, his Rebbe, decided to bring back smicha, okay, to the Jewish people and create a Sanhedrin in Tzfat, right? The first Sanhedrin after thousands of years, right? The big man who was against it was Reb Levi ibn Chabib. And he wrote a very tough response, and his response were to why you shouldn't bring it back, right? And that stopped everything in its tracks. Okay, but that's not our discussion today, but I'm just telling you, he was a troublemaker. But he did a great job on the Ein Yaakov, and he took out the Ein Yaakov. Now, the question is why? Okay, so it's clear in the introduction to the Ein Yaakov, and maybe during this time we'll even learn a bit of the introduction. It's clear that he wanted to take out ideas that led to Yerushalayim, Tshuva, and so on and so forth. Okay, that's clear. The question is, for who did he want to do that? So most people come along and say he wanted to do it for the people who can't really learn Gemara because they weren't educated enough, or after a full day of work, they were too tired. But stories always grab the person. Halacha is sometimes for some people after a 12-hour workday a little bit boring, but stories are always good, right? People love stories. So stories of the Talmud, stories about Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Chanina ben Tradion, the Amoraim, the Tanoim, right? I have a different take on it, and I want to share it with you. It's a little bit of a chiddush. I never saw it anywhere, right? I have a take that he saw that people were not becoming Yorei Shamayim, and I'm talking not about ignorant people. I'm talking about people who are Talmidei Chachamim, right? And he wanted to pluck it out and separate it so it would become a work unto its own. And therefore, when you're studying Talmud, you would not just skip over, which till today in yeshivas, they skip over Agadita. A lot of yeshivas just skip right over it. Of course, the Rebbe says you should learn it through, and then, we'll go to the next thing. He's got to give the lip service, of course. But I remember in yeshiva, that's all it was, a lip service. And people went on to the next sugya, halachic sugya, and they either skipped over or they, said it like Tillim, they just went right through it like a kapitel Tillim, and they did that, right? So, by the way, in Daf Yomi, also I've noticed that people giving Daf Yomi, they give a lot more, you get a lot more stress on the halacha than the Agada. I know it's the rabbi who teaches Daf Yomi. I've noticed he goes a little bit quicker on that daf when it's Agada, but he'll say because the daf becomes very large because there's much less Tosfos and Rashi on it, so the daf becomes very large, and therefore he's got to go through it quicker because he won't finish the daf, right? Whereas a lot of times the daf is pretty small if it's halacha. But okay, it's a good excuse. But the point over here is that they don't really take as much time to do that as they do halacha. I think that Ibn Chaviv decided that if he plucks it out and makes it separate, as a separate limud, people will start getting much more into Agada than not then halacha, but like they do in halacha. Okay? And he wasn't wrong, and I'll tell you how I know it. Because, okay, the Maharal Prague lived while Reb Yaakov Chaviv was alive. He was younger than him. Okay, he was already in the early 16th century, maybe the late 15th century, but early 16th century, right? And the Maharal, all his works are all on Agadah. We don't have almost anything from the Maharal and Halacha. Right after the work of the Ein Yaakov was published, all of a sudden the Maharal starts writing volumes. He has like 15 volumes of works. Its vast majority is on Agadah, almost nothing on Halacha. Okay, now, of course, he has stuff on the Medrash Rabbah, Medrash Tanchuma as well, but most of his stuff is on the Talmud. Okay, same thing in the 17th century, very early, late 16th, early 17th. There's another fellow which we're going to study. He's known as the Marsha. His name was Rav Shmuel Adels, and he wrote a complete commentary, not only Halacha, but he wrote a complete commentary on Agadah, right? And he wrote separate commentaries. They were separate, okay? Today, we have them in the Shas Gemara as they're mixed together. In other words, he has Halacha and Agadah, Halacha of the Marsha, Rav Shmuel Adels. By the way, he's named after, he gave his last name after his mother-in-law. Her name was Adel, and he calls himself Shmuel Adels because she's the one who built his yeshiva. She supported his yeshiva. She was a wealthy woman. So he took her last name and got rid of his last name. So we know him as Shmuel Adels because of his mother-in-law. And he wrote a very complete commentary on the halacha, a commentary that everybody wants to learn how to learn has to learn. Every child that starts Gemara in 7th, 8th, 9th grade, if he's not learning Marsha, he won't learn how to learn. Okay? Many Gedolei Torah have already said it. The Chazon Ish is very famous for writing it, right? Which is a commentary on the Gemara, Rashi, and Tosfot. An excellent commentary, very, very thought through and very succinct commentary. And on Agadah also, he has very logical approach to the Agadah, not as creative as the Maharal, but very, very down to earth, and we'll see it in what he says. Right now, the Marsha's commentary got published on the Ein Yaakov. Okay, so on one side you have Rashi, and the other side you have the Marsha. Right, when there's a Tosfos, they quote Tosfos at the bottom as well, but most of the commentary is the Marsha, and there's other commentaries on the page that eventually the Vilna edition we have in the Vilna edition. Okay, that is what we're going to be studying, right? We're going to be studying a number of different types of Agadot. If you go back to page 2, we'll discuss this at greater length at another point, but if you go back to page 2, we have 5 types of Agadot. There's really 6. We'll talk about that at a different point, but there's 5 that are basic. We have basic types of Agadot, stories that fill in gaps or supply new information to biblical narrative. That's the ones you know best. That's the ones that the little kids come home and tell their parents and think it's in the Torah, right? They come home and say Avram was thrown into the Kivshan Aish, or something like, something about Moshe Rabbeinu that's not in the text, right? That Moshe Rabbeinu wouldn't nurse from the Egyptian women. He only nursed we learned about this. He only nursed from a Jewish woman, right? That's all in the Agadah. It doesn't say it says that they looked for a nursing woman, right? Because Bat Paro didn't have a child, so she couldn't feed the child with breast milk, right? So they searched out. But here, in other words, or that that Yocheved and Amram divorced and then they got married again. That's all midrash. It's not in the text, right? So, but it adds to the biblical narrative and it gives some interesting stuff to the biblical narrative. That's the first thing. Historical stories that happened during the Talmudic period. We have historical stories. We're going to learn one of those today, right? Stories about the lives of the rabbis, their families of the Tanaic and Amoraic period, right? You can have stories about the rabbis themselves, right? And their families, right? And then you have 4 is sayings and stories to teach us how to live a Jewish life. We'll have you have in Pirkei Avot, very similar, right? How to live a Jewish life. They'll tell you, they'll talk about certain ideas that are, they'll be Jewish ideas, right? Ezu chacham alomid mikol adam, right? That's a saying, right? And then you have stories. We'll see stories that teach you about how to live a Jewish life. And then you have parables that have a hidden meaning. Okay, the parables have a meaning. They look strange. Those parables, they look very strange. They don't look like real, right? One of them that I have on this page is, I'm just quoting a Rashi, is that the donkey that Moshe rode on is the same donkey that Avram rode on, and is the same donkey that Mashiach will ride on, right? I quote that on the right side of the page. I quote the pasuk, and I quote the Rashi. Al chamar miyuchad hu chamar shechavash Avram lakedas Yitzchak v'hu atid melech HaMashiach ligolat olam. And that's the same donkey that Melech HaMashiach will be on, like it says, ani v'rochav al chamar. He's going to be a humble person. Doesn't mean a poor person, a humble person, and he will ride on a chamar because he's humble. What is a haughty person, right? Rides on a horse, a white horse, not a white donkey, right? A donkey is not like something that, it's a horse is like a Cadillac, a Mercedes. A donkey is a Chevrolet. It's not anything special. So that's but it's the same donkey, right? It looks like it's the same donkey. So that's really a mushal for something, because of course it's not the same donkey. There's no donkey waiting in Beit Lechem for us to ride upon 3,000 years later. It's a 3,000-year-old donkey, right? I don't think he'll be able to move very far. He'll never get to Jerusalem, that's for sure, if he's 3,000 years old, right? So the Maharal Mipraga already says this, that it's only a mushal for something. It's not really the real donkey, right? So I'm not going to talk about that now, but that's an example of a parable. But then we have other parables in the Talmud that are really, really strange. We're going to talk about them. Some very strange things go on in the Talmud, and they have many times a hidden meaning, and we'll have to talk about those as well. There is a sixth one, which I'll mention at a different point. What all these have in common, and that's why I listed 5, is because they all have one thing in common. We're going to take a message from them. Okay, the 6th category, there may not be a message. I'm not going to talk about it now, but the 5 is we're going to take messages from all these. The Talmud didn't write something historical to just record something historical conversation. There's no point in that. And that we'll see very much today when we will begin at least this medrash. So let's go on now. I didn't go through the Rambam yet. We'll do that at a different point. But let's go through a short Gemara that you definitely know part of this Gemara. I'm not sure you know all of it, right? The famous Gemara that Reb Shimon Bar Yochai hides in a cave with his son for 12 years, then 13 years, right? And then comes out of the cave. That's the part we all know about Lag BaOmer. Your teacher told it to you every year, right before Lag BaOmer, right? And there he revealed the Zohar and so on and so forth. Depends how creative you want to get, right? But why did he run away to the cave? That's the big question. Does everybody know why he ran away to the cave? What happened that caused him to have to run away from the Romans, right? And this is the short story that happened. And we start that story on page 1 where I underlined it. And the story starts like this. Why did they call Reb Yehuda the head speaker in every place? Reb Yehuda, in the time of the Tanoim, students of Rabbi Akiva, he was called Rosh HaMedabrim. He always started speaking. He was always the person that was the spokesman for the Jewish people. And the Gemara before, right, the Gemara before discusses, right, something about Rabbi Yehuda, and they call him Rosh HaMedabrim. So here's how we get to this story, is we want to know why he became known as the spokesman for the Jewish people, the Rosh HaMedabrim. The Yasvi Reb Yehuda sat, Reb Yossi and Reb Shimon. And you know in the Talmud, whenever it says Reb Shimon, it means Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Okay? Again, when it's a Tana, it's Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. V'Yosef Yehuda ben Gerim Gabai. And there was a fellow by the name of Yehuda, the son of converts, was sitting there as well, which sounds like he was listening to three rabbis speaking, which makes a lot of sense. You know, you go to three great rabbis like Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yossi, and Rabbi Shimon. So he wanted to hear what they're talking about. Pasach Rabbi Yehuda v'Amar. Rabbi Yehuda said the following thing: Kama na'im ma'aseim shel umazu. How beautiful are the actions of this nation. Which nation? Rome. Okay, we're talking about Rome here. The Rome who killed Rabbi Hanina ben Tradia. The Rome who killed Rabbi Akiva. Okay, the Rome who made it also to learn Torah. Rabbi Yehuda comes along and he says, how beautiful are the actions of this nation. Tiknu shvakim. They made marketplaces. They created commerce in Israel. That's what Rashi says. He calls it, he doesn't call it the word commerce, but he basically describes it as commerce. And they created malls. You know, malls made a lot of money for a lot of people, not just for the builders of the malls, but the shoppers of the malls, right? Till when I was growing up, when you wanted to go buy, you know, a suit, you went to one store. When you wanted to buy a skirt, you went to a different store, right? And then, of course, they came out with what's called the department store, like Macy's, right? Which you had in, but now in the mall, you have all the different types of stores of clothing, all on one, basically in one place, right? So they made marketplaces. That was something new. We didn't have that before. Tiknu Shurin, they made bridges, okay? To a bridge makes one part of the country connected with the other part of the country, right? It's very hard to get from one place to the other if you don't have the bridge. You got to take a boat, you got to take a shuttle, right? Tiknu merchatzaot. And the third thing they did was they created bathhouses, right? So this is a beautiful thing. They really upgraded our country. I mean, they also destroyed our country, but they upgraded our country by creating malls, commerce, bridges, and bathhouses, right? Reb Yossi Shata. Reb Yossi was quiet, right? Sometimes the best thing is to keep quiet, right? Nana Reb Shimon ben Yochai. Shimon ben Yochai answered for Omar, the reason why they did these things, they did it only for their own self-centered reasons, right? B'shvil atzmam, they had a self-centered reason. There was an agenda. Tiknu shvakim lo shibem zonos. They enacted marketplaces in order to put in there prostitutes, right? In other words, this is what they created. They created commerce, but they created commerce in order that there would be prostitutes and people would have their physical pleasures. Because as we know, the Romans were completely sunk into physical pleasures, right? Merchatzos laden bahem atzmam. And merchatzot similarly was to have pleasure, from the word Gan Eden, right? Laden et atzmam, to make themselves beautiful, to make themselves pleasurable. That's why, by the way, it doesn't put it in the order of the first thing. The first thing was, right, shvakim, tiknu shvakim, sharim, and merchatzos. Here he says first tiknu shvakim and merchatzos, then, because they're very similar. The prostitute is for physical sexual pleasure, and the bathhouse is for like just, you know, a pleasure, like a pleasure time of sitting there in your tub and just, you know, enjoying your, you know, making your skin beautiful. It's very physicality. Ksharim is a little bit different, right? Litol, this is the next page. Mehem mechasim. They built bridges so they can collect tolls. What do you think? Again, we have sex, we have pleasure, we have power, money, right? That's what they were about, the Romans. You think they did it in order to beautify? They did it they made beautiful things. It was all self-centered. It was all, what's in it for me? It was all to make, you know, it was all to get more, sexual power and monetary power. And and to create, a society that would be very, very engrossed in materialism. Halach Yehuda ben Gerim v'siper divreim v'nishmu lamalchus. Rabbi Yehuda, it doesn't say Rabbi Yehuda, it says Yehuda ben Gerim went and he told their words and it was heard to the kingdom. Meaning he didn't report them to the kingdom. He spoke to somebody else, but little by little it got back to the kingdom. Because that's what it says, Nishma'u lamalchus. He didn't tell on them. He was a ger. He was a real ger, a God-fearing person. Or he wasn't actually a ger. He was a son of gerim, right? He was probably already what we call an FFB, right? And he went and he told people about what he heard. In other words, he heard from Gedolei Torah. They were talking about Rome and things that Rome had done. But it got heard to the kingdom. Amru Yehuda she'ila yitaleh. So the Romans said, Yehuda that gave us praise, we're going to pick him up. Okay? Meaning, he's going to become the Rosh HaMedabrim. He's going to become the spokesman for the Jewish people. Now we know how he became the spokesman. Yossi Shotak Yiglo Tzipori. He was quiet. He didn't praise us, but he didn't either criticize us. So he's going to get exiled from Jerusalem to Tzipori in the north, right? Tzipori is the place where eventually, not far from over there, we got the Mishnah, the Sanhedrin went to Tzipori, right? So a lot of rabbis were in Tzipori, so it wasn't a terrible place to go, obviously. Shimon Shegina, he spoke derogatorily, Yehareg, death to Shimon, okay? Osalhu Berei Toshu Beit Midrasha. Him and his son went and they hid, Toshu means to hide, in the Beit Midrash. Kol Yuma Havis Mighty Lahu Devitu Rifta Vikuza Demaya Vakarche. Every day, his wife, okay, Devitu means Devit is the wife, would bring them bread and water. Rifta is bread, and kuza is a flask, a small flask of water, and they would eat. Okay, that's the end of this story. There's much more to it. Of course, the whole cave and everything comes in this story. But of course, the biggest question over here is, which we're going to probably have to answer next week, but I'm going to leave it with you, right? The question is, this is crazy. I mean, the Gemara tells us a story about Yehuda saying how beautiful the actions of this country are, right? And Reb Shimon Bar Yochai says, what are you talking about? Beautiful? They're disgusting people. They're doing it all for their own needs. They're very self-centered people. There's an agenda here, right? Why is this important for us to know? Why did Rabbi Yehuda have to praise the Romans? It's a little bit strange that Rabbi Yehuda is praising the Romans, right? They're having the discussion of how nice the Empire State Building looks. They have a discussion on how beautiful I could comment on a beautiful mall. The Edmonton Mall is gorgeous, or the mall in New Jersey. I forget what they call it, right? The mall in New Jersey that who built those malls? The famous family. I forget the name of the Persian family. Ramesian family built, right? So if I could say that, but would you expect, Rav Shach to talk about it? You expect Rav Shach to say how beautiful the Ramesian Mall is. I could just hear Rav Shach Zechron Levracha saying such a thing. I mean, come on, right? Rabbi Yehuda says it, and Rav Shimon Bar Yochai is arguing with him, right, about this discussion. Why is this discussion important, right? Why do we have to know about it? Why did the Talmud write it? So you say the Talmud wrote about it to tell us why Rabbi Yehuda became the Rosh HaMedabrim and why Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai had to hide, right? But why did they discuss it in the first place? What's the point over here? So this question, by the way, is raised explicitly by Ramosha Feinstein. Okay, Ramosha Feinstein raises questions, what are these rabbis talking about shtuyot? Right? That's what he raises, and he tries to answer it. And Rav Kook doesn't raise the question, but you see he's trying to answer the question as well. Okay, and next week we'll see what Moshe Feinstein says as opposed to what Rav Kook says. And from Rav Kook, we're going to be learning a piece of hashkafa that you always knew existed, but you didn't know where it came from. Rav Kook says it comes from this Gemara, but we're not going to tell you what it is yet. Any comments?
I think it's all too new. There's too much
Okay.
information.
Think about it over the week, and we'll come to it next week, Bezrat Hashem. Take care.